WH80 Paris actually looked like 1000 to 100 years ago. Walk across any bridge into central Paris today and you're entering one of the world's most famous cities. The Eiffel Tower pierces the skyline. The Louvre dominates the right bank. Notre-Dame Cathedral, even after the fire, stands as a monument to medieval architectural genius. 800 years of construction, art, and urban planning have made Paris synonymous with civilization itself. But rewind exactly 1000 to 100 years, to the year 825 AD, and step onto that same island in the Seine, the La de la Cité, and you wouldn't recognize it. There's no Eiffel Tower, no Louvre, no Notre-Dame Cathedral, no broad boulevards or stone bridges, no Latin Quarter filled with students and bookshops. Instead, you'd see a small Carolingian town of wooden buildings and muddy streets, clustered on a single island, surrounded by marshland and abandoned Roman ruins. The population was perhaps 10,000 people, a fraction of what Paris would become. The right bank was mostly swamp. The left bank was fields and crumbling Roman walls. This is the story of Paris when it was barely Paris at all, a minor settlement in the Frankish Empire, decades away from Viking invasions that would force it to become something greater. The ghost of Roman Lutetia. To understand Paris in 825 AD, you need to understand what came before and what had been lost. Paris began as Lutetia, a Gallo-Roman city founded in the 1st century BC. At its peak in the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, Lutetia was a prosperous provincial town of perhaps 15 to 20,000 inhabitants. The Romans built it on both banks of the Seine, with the left bank as the main settlement. There was a forum, an amphitheater, public baths, temples, aqueducts, and a grid of paved streets. The La de la Cité served as the fortified administrative center, but by 825 AD, that Roman city was gone. The amphitheater, capable of seating 15,000 spectators, was buried and forgotten. It wouldn't be rediscovered until 1869. The Arnes de Lutzi, as it's known today, was invisible in the early 9th century, completely covered by earth and vegetation. The forum was in ruins. The public baths, the Thermes de Cluny, parts of which still stand today, were abandoned, their heating systems broken, their pools dry. The aqueduct that had brought fresh water from springs south of the city had been cut during barbarian invasions in the 3rd and 4th centuries and never repaired. The paved Roman streets were cracked and overgrown. Most of the left bank settlement had been abandoned. What remained of the Roman walls were crumbling stone shells, useful only as quarries for medieval builders who needed cut stone. Paris in 825 AD was built on top of Lutetia's corpse, but it had forgotten how to be Lutetia, geography, and the La Cité. The Paris of 825 AD existed primarily on the La de la Cité, the boat-shaped island in the middle of the Seine. This island, roughly 900 meters long and 300 meters wide, was the heart of the settlement. Why the island? Defense. After the collapse of Roman authority in the 5th century and subsequent invasions by Franks, Burgundians, and others, defensive positions mattered more than urban planning. The Seine provided natural protection on all sides. Wooden bridges connected the island to both banks, but these could be destroyed or blocked if enemies approached. The right bank in 825 AD was largely uninhabited. It was marshy, prone to flooding, and considered unsuitable for permanent settlement. A few scattered buildings existed near the riverbank, along with some vineyards on higher ground, but the area that would later become the Marais district, the Louvre, and the Grand Boulevards was mostly wetland and fields. The left bank had more settlement than the right bank, but far less than in Roman times. A few churches and monasteries occupied strategic points. The Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, founded in the 6th century by King Childebert I, stood west of the island and was already an important religious center. Farther south, the Church of Saint Genevieve VE crowned the hill now known as the Montagne Saint Genevieve VE, built to honor Paris's patron saint who had supposedly saved the city from Attila the Hun in 451 AD. But between these religious outposts, the left bank was fields, ruins, and scattered farms, architecture and building materials. The architecture of Paris in 825 AD was overwhelmingly wooden. Stone was expensive and difficult to work without the engineering knowledge and slave labor that had built Roman Lutetia. Most buildings, homes, workshops, storage sheds were timber-frame structures with wattle and daub walls. Wattle and daub was a construction method using woven wooden lattices filled with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and animal dung, then plastered over. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, sometimes wooden shingles for wealthier families. These buildings were fire hazards, and fires swept through medieval settlements regularly. The exceptions to this wooden architecture were churches and the royal palace. These were built in stone, often reusing Roman materials. Columns, foundation stones, and cut blocks from abandoned Roman buildings were hauled to construction sites and incorporated into new Christian structures. On the La de la Cité, the royal palace complex occupied the western end of the island, roughly where the Palais de Justice stands today. This palace was the seat of Carolingian administration when royal officials visited Paris. It included a great hall for assemblies, a chapel, residential quarters, and defensive walls. The palace was built of stone, but was modest compared to later medieval royal residences. This was not Versailles. It was a functional administrative and military center. The churches on the island in 825 AD included an early cathedral dedicated to Saint Stephen, which stood on the site where Notre-Dame would later be built. This earlier cathedral was a smaller, simpler structure built in the Merovingian period, possibly dating to the 6th or 7th century. It was built of stone with a wooden roof, narrow windows, and dark interiors lit by candles and small oil lamps. There was no Notre Dame in 825 AD. The Gothic cathedral we know today would not begin construction until 1163, more than 300 years later. Streets were narrow, unpaved, and muddy. There was no sewage system. Waste was thrown into the street or into the river. Pigs and chickens wandered freely, scavenging garbage. The smell would have been overwhelming by modern standards, a mixture of human and animal waste, smoke from cooking fires, rotting organic matter, and river silt. Population and social structure. Estimating the population of Paris in 825 AD is difficult because no census records survive from this period. Historians estimate the population was between 8,000 and 15,000 people, concentrated mostly on the La de la Cité with smaller numbers on the left bank near the monasteries. This was a tiny fraction of what Paris would later become. By comparison, Paris in 1300 AD had a population of around 200,000, making it one of the largest cities in Europe. In 825 AD, Paris was a minor town in the Carolingian Empire. Aachen, Charlemagne's capital, was far more important. Rome, Constantinople, and Rhoda dwarfed Paris in size, wealth, and influence. The social structure was rigidly hierarchical. At the top were the king and his officials. In 825 AD, the Carolingian Empire was ruled by Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne. Louis ruled from 814 to 840 AD. He spent most of his time in Aachen or other imperial residences, but Paris remained a royal possession, and royal officials administered it on his behalf. The Count of Paris was the king's representative, a noble responsible for collecting taxes, administering justice, and commanding local military forces. In the early 9th century, this office was held by members of powerful Frankish families loyal to the Carolingian dynasty. Below the nobility were freemen, merchants, craftsmen, and landowning farmers. These men had legal rights, could own property, and owed military service to the king. Blacksmiths, carpenters, bakers, leatherworkers, and boatmen made up this class. Further down the social ladder were semi-free peasants and serfs who worked the land surrounding Paris. They owed labor and produce to landowners, whether noble or ecclesiastical. Their lives were tied to the soil, and they had few legal protections. Slaves still existed in 825 AD, though slavery was declining across Western Europe under Christian influence. Most slaves were war captives or people sold into bondage due to debt. They had no legal rights and were considered property. The church formed a parallel hierarchy. Bishops, abbots, and priests wielded significant power, often owning vast tracts of land and commanding the loyalty of monastic communities. The Bishop of Paris was an important figure, overseeing religious life on the Île de la Cité and the surrounding region. Daily life in 825 AD Paris. What was daily life like for someone living in Paris in 825 AD? Most people woke at dawn. Candles and oil lamps were expensive, so work and activity followed the sun. Breakfast, if eaten, was bread dipped in wine or ale. Water from the Seine was unsafe to drink due to contamination, so weak ale or watered wine was the standard beverage for adults and children alike. The main meal was eaten around midday. For common people, this meant bread, porridge made from barley or oats, onions, cabbage, turnips, and beans. Meat was rare, perhaps salted pork on feast days or fish from the Seine. The wealthy ate better, roasted meat, game birds, white bread made from wheat, and imported luxuries like honey and spices. Work dominated life. Farmers tended fields on the outskirts of the settlement, growing wheat, barley, oats, and vegetables. Women managed households, spun wool, wove cloth, brewed ale, and preserved food. Children worked from a young age, helping with farm chores, tending animals, or learning trades from their parents. Craftsmen worked in small workshops along the riverbanks. Blacksmiths forged iron tools and weapons. Potters made clay vessels. Leather workers produced shoes, belts, and harnesses. Carpenters built boats and repaired buildings. Trade happened in open-air markets on the Île de la Cité. Merchants sold produce, cloth, tools, and pottery. Coins were in circulation. Silver deniers minted under Carolingian authority, but barter was still common, especially among the poor. Hygiene was minimal. Most people never bathed in the modern sense. Rivers and public wells provided water for washing, but soap was rare and expensive. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were ubiquitous. Disease was rampant. Life expectancy was perhaps 30 to 40 years. Infant mortality was staggering. Perhaps 30 to 40% of children died before age 5. Entertainment was simple. Religious festivals and saints' feast days provided breaks from labor. Storytelling, dice games, and drinking in alehouses were common pastimes. Traveling performers, jugglers, musicians, storytellers occasionally visited, especially during religious festivals. Literacy was extremely rare. Only clergy and a small number of nobles could read and write. Knowledge was oral, passed down through apprenticeships, family traditions, and church teachings. Religion and the Church. The Catholic Church was the dominant institution in Paris in 825 AD. Christianity had fully replaced Roman paganism, and the Church controlled not only spiritual life, but also education, charity, and significant landholdings. The Île de la Cité had the Cathedral of Saint-Étienne, the seat of the Bishop of Paris. This was the center of religious authority in the region. Services were conducted in Latin, which most lay people did not understand. Participation was passive. Congregants stood or knelt while priests performed the rituals of the Mass. On the left bank, the Abbey of Saint-Germain-des-Prés was one of the most important monastic institutions in the region. Benedictine monks lived there, following the rule of Saint Benedict, a life of prayer, work, and study. The abbey owned extensive lands, vineyards, and forests. It operated a scriptorium where monks copied religious texts, preserving Christian and some classical knowledge. The church also ran the only schools. Boys from wealthy families, and those destined for the priesthood, received education in reading, writing, Latin grammar, and Christian theology. This education was the preserve of a tiny elite. Religion permeated daily life. Church bells marked the hours. Sundays and feast days were work-free, dedicated to worship. Relics, bones, or belongings of saints were venerated, believed to perform miracles and protect communities. The tomb of Saint Genevieve was a pilgrimage site. However, the church in 825 AD was also deeply intertwined with political power. Bishops and abbots were appointed by kings and nobles, often as rewards for loyalty. Simony buying church offices was common. Monasteries could be corrupt, their monks more focused on wealth and power than spiritual discipline. political control and the Carolingian Empire in 825 AD. Paris was part of the Carolingian Empire, the vast realm assembled by Charlemagne and inherited by his son, Louis the Pious. Charlemagne had died in 814 AD. Louis the Pious ruled the empire from 814 to 840 AD, but his reign was marked by internal conflict. His sons Lothair, Pepin, and Louis the German would eventually rebel, leading to civil war and the Treaty of Verdun in 843 AD, which divided the empire into 3 kingdoms. Paris in 825 AD was not a capital. Aachen, in modern-day Germany, was the imperial seat. Paris was administered by a count appointed by the king. This count collected taxes, enforced royal laws, commanded local military levies, and presided over a court that handled disputes and criminal cases. Justice was harsh and public. Theft could result in mutilation, cutting off a hand or ear. Murder was punishable by death, often by hanging. Trial by ordeal was still practiced. Accused individuals might be forced to carry hot iron or plunge their hands into boiling water, with guilt or innocence determined by how their wounds healed. Political power was personal and fragmented. Loyalty was based on oaths between lords and vassals, not abstract concepts of nationhood or citizenship. The king granted land to nobles in exchange for military service. Those nobles, in turn, granted portions of their land to lesser nobles and knights, creating a pyramid of obligation. Paris had no formal city government, no mayor, no elected council. Authority flowed from the king through his appointed representatives. Economy and trade. The economy of Paris in 825 AD was primarily agricultural and local. There was no large-scale manufacturing, no international trade networks comparable to what would develop in later medieval centuries. The Seine was the economic lifeline. Boats transported grain, wine, timber, and stone up and down the river. Fishing provided a supplementary food source, though overfishing and pollution limited yields. Surrounding Paris were farms, vineyards, and forests. Wheat and barley were the primary grain crops. Grapes were grown for wine, which was consumed daily and also traded. Forests provided timber for construction and fuel, as well as game for hunting. Markets on the Rue de la Cité operated several days a week. Farmers sold produce. Craftsmen sold tools, pottery, and cloth. Merchants traded salt, essential for preserving meat and metal goods. Long-distance trade was limited but existed. Merchants from the Low Countries, the Rhineland, and northern Italy occasionally reached Paris, bringing luxury goods, spices, silk, fine metalwork, and glass. These goods were available only to the wealthy elite. Coinage was in use. The Carolingian monetary system was based on the silver denier. 12 deniers equaled 1 sou, and 20 sous equaled 1 livre, though the sou and livre were units of account, not actual coins. Most transactions among common people still involved barter: eggs for bread, labor for grain. The church was a major economic actor, owning vast estates, collecting tithes 10% of agricultural production, and employing laborers. Monasteries were economic centers, producing wine, manuscripts, and textiles. Defense and fortifications. Paris in 825 AD was defended, but not heavily fortified compared to what would come later. The Rue de la Cité had walls remnants of the Roman fortifications, reinforced and repaired in the early Middle Ages. These walls were stone, several meters high, with wooden gates at the bridges. The walls enclosed the royal palace, the cathedral, and the main residential area. The bridges themselves were wooden and defensible. In times of danger, they could be dismantled or blocked to prevent enemies from crossing. However, in 825 AD, Paris had not yet faced the threat that would transform it into a fortress city: the Vikings. The first Viking raid on Paris would occur in 845 AD, just 20 years later, when Norse longships sailed up the Seine and attacked the city. The Vikings would return repeatedly throughout the 9th century, culminating in the famous siege of Paris in 885–886 AD, when the city's defenders held out for months against a massive Viking army. In response to these attacks, Paris would build much stronger fortifications. But in 825 AD, those defenses didn't yet exist. The city was vulnerable, its wooden bridges and modest stone walls insufficient against a determined assault. The military force available to defend Paris was small. The count could call upon his retainers, armed men who owed him service, and levy freemen from the surrounding countryside. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen who fought when required. They carried spears, shields, and sometimes swords or axes. Armor was rare, limited to the wealthy. Cavalry was the elite military force. Mounted warriors, the predecessors of medieval knights, formed the backbone of Carolingian armies. But Paris itself had few such men. Paris was not. It's important to understand what Paris was not in 825 AD. It was not a cultural capital. There were no universities, no great libraries, no philosophical debates in public squares. The University of Paris would not be founded until the 12th century. It was not an architectural marvel. The Gothic cathedrals, the Louvre, the grand palaces, all of these were centuries in the future. The Paris of 825 AD was wood, mud, and scavenged Roman stone. It was not a center of political power. Real power resided in Aachen with the emperor. Paris was a regional administrative center, nothing more. It was not populous. With perhaps 10,000 people, it was smaller than many other European cities of the time. Paris in 825 AD was a frontier town on the edge of the Carolingian world, still recovering from the collapse of Rome, not yet aware of the Viking storms that would soon force it to evolve. From muddy island to city of light, the Paris of 825 AD cramped on a single island, surrounded by ruins and marshland, with wooden houses and muddy streets. There's almost no resemblance to the Paris we know today. But that small Carolingian town contained the seeds of what would come. The Rue de la Cité remained the heart of Paris as the city grew. The churches and monasteries founded in the early Middle Ages became centers of learning and power. The bridges, repeatedly destroyed and rebuilt, eventually became permanent stone crossings. The Viking raids that began in 845 AD forced Paris to fortify, to organize, to defend itself. By the 10th century, the Counts of Paris, the Capetian dynasty, would become kings of France, and Paris would become a royal capital. The centuries that followed brought Gothic architecture, universities, expanding population, and cultural brilliance. By 1200 AD, Notre-Dame was rising on the Rue de la Cité. By 1300 AD, Paris was one of Europe's greatest cities, but in 825 AD, none of that was inevitable. Paris was just a town, muddy, wooden, vulnerable, and small. The transformation from that forgotten outpost to the city of light took 1,000 years of growth, destruction, rebuilding, and reinvention. Walking across a Paris bridge today, surrounded by stone monuments and millions of people, it's almost impossible to imagine the empty marshland and isolated island that existed 12 centuries ago. But that's where Paris began, not as a capital, but as a survivor, clinging to an island in the Seine, waiting for history to push it toward greatness.